My name is Tom Duesterberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Program on Manufacturing and Society in the 21st Century here at the Institute. Wanted to welcome you on behalf of the Institute, both those in the audience and those viewing remotely. I wanted to ask our President, Walter Isaacson, just to say a few words. It's always dangerous when your boss knows as much or more than you about something, the subject matter.
That is definitely untrue, and that's why it's such a pleasure to have Tom here at the Aspen Institute, because the one thing we do know about the issue of manufacturing is how important it is to America's economy and how ridiculous it is to try to think of a great economy that doesn't also have a healthy manufacturing sector. And so when we were looking at the Aspen Institute and all the things we do in terms of the creation of jobs and the economy, we felt that there was a huge gap because people kind of understood the reduction of manufacturing jobs in America, that it was happening, but nobody was as focused as they should be, even though there had been a presidential commission and a call for this and many other things. So when Tom and I and Elliot Gerson and others talked, it was with a realization that understanding how to make a healthy manufacturing sector in America was key to our economy and to the 21st century. So that's why it's great to have Tom and this program here. Thanks.
Okay, this is the seventh in a series of programs we've been doing underneath this program. Our next one will be on November the 28th here in this room. We'll be exploring the impact of the energy renaissance on U.S. manufacturing. It will feature Congressman Cal Dooley, who's now the head of the American Chemistry Council, Hal Sirkin of Boston Consulting Group, and Tom Peterson of the Center for Climate Strategies, each of which has recent reports on the importance of this subject. I want to thank the supporters who make the program, the manufacturing program here, possible. These include the Apollo Group, Bison Gear and Engineering, Deloitte, Madison Capital Partners, Manufacturers Institute for Productivity and Innovation, the National Association of Manufacturers, National Science Foundation, Parker Hannifin, Toyota Motor, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and William Budinger. Today's program explores the policies needed to strengthen U.S. manufacturing in the near term. I note that the topic of manufacturing was mentioned 15 times in Tuesday's presidential debate, and our two panelists are fully able to elaborate on the candidates' positions, but also their own deep knowledge of the subject. Our partner for this event is the Conference on the Renaissance of American Manufacturing, headed by Gilbert Kaplan. Like I am, Gil is an alumnus of the International Trade Administration at the Commerce Department. Unlike me, he's a distinguished trade lawyer responsible for many of the trade enforcement actions that we've seen in this town in recent years. Gil, I'd like for you to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming today. When we started the Conference on the Renaissance of American Manufacturing about 2 years ago now, in 2010, and when the other group I work with, the Committee to Support U.S. Trade Laws, looked at these issues, we felt we really needed to focus more on manufacturing in the United States. We needed to make this a central feature of the policy debate in Washington and the political debate in Washington, and that's been our goal. So we're delighted to be able to have this debate with the Aspen Institute focusing on these critical manufacturing issues. We think they're critical to the national security of the United States. We think they're critical to the economic security of the United States. We also think that the interrelationship between trade and manufacturing is a central feature of this entire debate, and it's great to have people who are so knowledgeable about international trade as our speakers today. I'd first like to introduce Grant Aldonas, who's the Principal Managing Director of Split Rock International, a Washington, D.C. based trade and investment consulting firm he founded in 2006. Mr. Aldonas also serves as an adjunct professor of law and a member of the board of directors of the Institute for International Economic Law at Georgetown University Law Center. From 2001 to 2005, he was the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade And in that capacity, according to his biography, he served as America's salesman. And I hope he got a commission for all those sales, because there are a lot of exports, and he certainly deserved it. Before assuming his position as Undersecretary of Commerce, Mr. Aldonas served as Chief International Trade Counsel to the Senate Finance Committee, and he is here on behalf of the Mitt Romney campaign. Our other speaker from the other side of the aisle is Dr. Jared Bernstein. He's currently on leave from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he was a senior fellow. From 2009 to 2011, Bernstein was the chief economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and a member of President Obama's economic team. Dr. Bernstein's areas of expertise include federal and state economic and fiscal policies, income inequality and mobility, trends in employment and earnings, international comparison and the analysis of financial and housing markets, and I'm also sure manufacturing. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Dr. Bernstein was a senior economist and the director of living standards at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And finally, we're very happy to have as our moderator Hedrick Smith, who is one of the great commentators and authors in the United States on policy and manufacturing and other issues. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter and editor, an Emmy Award-winning producer and correspondent. For 26 years, Mr. Smith served as a correspondent for the New York Times in Washington, Moscow, Cairo, Saigon, Paris, and the American South. I guess that's another foreign country to any of us from the... It's listed here. In 1971, as chief diplomatic correspondent, he was member of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that produced the Pentagon Papers series. He won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting from Russia and Eastern Europe, and he was formerly the New York Times Washington bureau chief and chief correspondent. But the most exciting thing is he's written this great book, Who Stole the American Dream, which goes over what's going on in the middle class, what's going on with the problems we're facing in America today, and how manufacturing relates to those. And we have about 50 free copies. There used to be 50. I see many have already taken them, but they're out on the table out there. I hope you'll take them. And if you don't get one, I'm sure Mr. Smith will not mind if you go to Amazon and buy a copy of this book. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hedrick Smith.
Thank you very much, Gil and Tom, for the introductions. Just quickly to let you know what the ground rules are, our object today is to cover as much territory as we can, so I've asked each of our speakers to hold their initial answers to the questions I'll pose to each of them to 90 seconds, and then if somebody wants to rebut the other side, 60 seconds rebuttal and
Candy. Sorry.
and happily, I was going to say, happily we're not here to worry about body language and stagecraft and smiling and frowning at how you look when the other guy is speaking, but we're here to talk about substance. This is a room full of people who know a lot about trade. We've got an audience around the country, and I hope you'll talk in America speak and not Washington speak today, both of you. And we are also a room full of people who probably believe very much in the importance of the manufacturing sector, but there are those, believe it or not, who will say manufacturing is passé, that America has been over the hill on manufacturing, that we need to move to be a service economy if we're going to be globally competitive. So I want to ask you, Mr. Aldonas, to begin with, and I'll ask a very similar question to Dr. Bernstein. Is manufacturing really important for the American economic future? If so, why? And what do we want from manufacturing? Is it jobs? Is it profits? Is it jobs overseas? Is it jobs at home? Should we have a Secretary of Manufacturing to go along with the Secretary of Agriculture and a Secretary of Wall Street, i.e. the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of Energy? And so, I mean, what do we need to do here? Why is it important?
Yeah, the short answer is it's absolutely critical. And the reason it's critical is that 90% of the patents that are produced every year comes out of the manufacturing sector. So long-term economic growth depends entirely on innovation to raise our productivity. And what drives that is the investment in innovation that comes out of the manufacturing sector. So what we want are the productivity gains. Now, that also spins off employment opportunities, a lot of other good things. But in terms of growth, this is where it starts.
Dr. Bernstein, nice, fast answer. Terrific, terrific.
Completely agree.
Okay, well,
I would add 70% of R&D out of the sector, as well as 90% of the patent.
but it's very easy to say you get productivity and therefore you get all these other benefits. But we've seen an awful lot of manufacturing jobs disappear while we were getting gains in productivity. 5.5 million manufacturing jobs disappeared in roughly the last dozen years. We've seen an awful lot of manufacturing jobs show up in other places, i.e. China particularly, but lots of other places. So why is manufacturing automatically a good deal for America, for the country? It's obviously a good deal for the companies that are involved in it, for the profits that are generated. But what's it going to do for the American middle class?
Well, two things. One, I always want to take on, because I had to do this with Lou Dobbs at one point over and over again, to point out that some of what we've seen with respect to the decline in labor employment is an artifact of how we count. I recall when, for example, Motorola outsourced its logistics and customs operation to UPS. Those jobs overnight stayed in America, but they were shifted in the service sector. And they were registered as a decline in manufacturing employment, when the reality was the boundary of Motorola as a firm had softened, and it now incorporated its supplier, UPS, as a part of that. We didn't lose manufacturing jobs simply by shifting them to UPS in effect.
So when you say you want to boost manufacturing and you've got these soft boundaries, what actually are you talking about? Because if there's constant leakage there, I mean, is it production jobs you're talking about, or is it engineering design jobs you're talking about? What are you talking about?
When I think about manufacturing employment, I think actually of the entire value chain, including those suppliers. And I want to ensure that we have investment on both sides of that in the United States. So things I'd love to see, Rick, are making sure that we have the best investment environment across all those things. Because when I've gone and talked with manufacturers, it's surprising how they recognize pretty easily that in the world we live in today, that a higher tax on their suppliers doesn't do them any good. So giving them a special break won't necessarily
Forgive me, I don't hear
help.
the answer to my question.
Sorry.
I don't hear the answer to my question in that. My question was, what kinds of jobs are you talking about? Production, engineering, design jobs, or these soft jobs that are bleeding off into service, and what is it going to do for the American middle class? Because the American middle class is stuck losing jobs that you say, well, they've been redefined.
No,
they've been losing jobs that have been paying real good wages
and
have supported a middle class standard of living.
But Rick, in fairness, it is both. I want the engineering jobs, I want the design jobs, I want that here in America. I also want to make sure that we have a very healthy set of suppliers that are a part of that manufacturing value chain that serves a global consumer market. So I don't want to deny that that's important as well while we focus on manufacturing. Because the reality from a manufacturer's perspective is they know that their suppliers have to be competitive as well. And they have to be employing people who are capable of the skills that drive what is now a global value chain. So it means we need both, right? Not exclusively focusing on the manufacturing side.
So let me jump in. So let me try to sharpen, I think, a difference here. And by the way, I haven't had a chance to say that it's a pleasure to talk to Grant about this.
As always.
We actually find a lot of, I think, areas of agreement and some good ones of disagreement too, but always substantively. And Rick, thank you for hosting today. You talk about substance. I know that's where you're coming from. Here's an area where I think we disagree regarding what we're talking about right now, this soft boundary. I used to think, as an economist, kind of card-carrying basis, that offshoring was actually kind of more benign than a lot of sort of Democrats typically thought it was. Just, it's part of globalization. If you accept globalization, you have to accept that. I've come to feel differently about that, particularly in this very space we're talking about, because there is now beginning to be evidence, and it's largely case studies, but they say the plural of anecdote is data, so we're getting there.
Or it's the fallacy of composition, one of the two.
One of the two. There's starting to be pretty compelling evidence that offshoring and the kind of manufacturing-based innovation that we're talking about are enemies, that they're actually negatively correlated, and that the actual proximity of the manufacturing process to the technology involved in that production is really important. And again, a couple of guys at Harvard did a couple of compelling case studies on this very issue, showing that we're starting to suffer negative innovation externalities because we're separating production and the technology. Now, one area where you haven't seen that so much is in computer chips, and that's turning out to be partly the exception to the rule, but B, we're actually seeing that now happen there as well. And some of our falling behind, for example, in the solar area is because we outsourced too much computer chip production and the technology therein. Whereas in economies like, say, Taiwan, I'm not saying it's a role model, but there's an example of a heavily subsidized initiative to bring that kind of linkage between production and research together. It's very important. We can't afford to offshore that.
I'd like to just have you,
just
not
a
just
second.
talk to it. I'm going to give you a chance.
Oh,
Okay? I'm going to feed it right to you. I'm going to feed it right to you. But I want to go beyond economists.
Yeah.
Because what's interesting to me is a guy like Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel.
Big proponent of the point I just made.
I was just going to actually quote him on the point. You know, he's saying moving production overseas hampers our ability to innovate, which is what you're talking about. Direct quote, the country's hurt. Abandoning today's commodity manufacturing can lock you out of tomorrow's emerging industry. Can we do the kind of rebuilding of manufacturing and innovation that you're talking about and continue the heavy trend of offshoring that we've had over the last decade or so?
Well, the answer is yes, because the reality is that for Foxconn in China, let's take the hardest case. They supply Apple with a lot of what they do, and they do the final assembly of the iPhone in my pocket, right? The reality is Apple dictates the machine tools that are used on the shop floor, the chemistry of the glass that's produced. The idea that Willie Shea up at Harvard has that we're somehow losing the industrial commons misunderstands what those manufacturers like Apple are doing, and they don't think of that as manufacturing value added. So in that sense, there is a difference between our approach. But I'm not sure at the end of the day it makes a difference policy-wise. Because when China adopts a series of policies that are explicitly designed to pull manufacturing jobs into China by virtue of subsidies, by virtue of their currency, things like that, we would agree that that's a distortion that flatly is inconsistent with the way a trading system ought to operate and deeply inconsistent with our interests. So when you see countries adopting that set of policies, I don't think, though we may have a difference about whether offshoring on the margins is good or bad, that it would alter what we would do there. And nor would it, from Andy Grove's perspective, when I've heard him speak, suggest that it comes to a different conclusion about trying to make this the best place to invest. Because I think where I agree with Jared is we want the clusters of innovation to be taking place in the United States, and we want an educational system that's producing people that are capable of participating in that process, both by a better public education and expanding access to universities. But to get there...
I got a time problem here. I just wonder if you've got any reply
I do.
to that.
No, I think that Grant is making me feel a little bit like the president maybe felt in the first debate, that, you know, the other guy's agreeing with you way too much. A lot of what you said, I think, is exactly right. I think you have to look at. I mean, part of what we want to do here today, and I think, you know, in an agreeable way, I'm sure, is to highlight some differences between the candidates on these issues. And I don't speak for the campaign, by the way. I speak as someone who's independent of that, but clearly supportive of those policies. That said, on two issues that you just mentioned, both training, of which the president has an $8 billion initiative focused largely on community colleges, working with employers and emphasizing advanced manufacturing. It's a really good initiative. Frankly, I don't think he himself talks about this stuff enough. He says he talks about manufacturing, doesn't talk enough about the policy he actually has on the books or in proposal to help. And then another one on these clusters, on manufacturing clusters. The Commerce Department, we have I see a friend, Pat Buckley, from the Commerce Department here today. The Commerce Department has numerous policies, both to incentivize innovation and specifically focused on clustering. And I can go into greater detail into what they are, but these are active policies. In fact, the innovation centers, of which I believe there's now one up and running in Youngstown, Ohio. There's going to be 14 more. This is a project that's actually up and running and funded. This is the classic kind of innovation coordination to help get from the lab to the factory floor. And any economy that fails to do that typically finds a valley of death between those two very important institutions. Unfortunately, I think the trend on the Republican side of the aisle, I certainly haven't heard anywhere near these kinds of details from the Romney campaign, is to go exactly the other way. The one thing is to get tough on China. They certainly say that. But I think you have to get down into the sort of the details that actually reify, that operationalize the kinds of connections you were making.
I got to call time.
Yep.
I want to move to another question. We're both talking about the candidates. Let's talk about the candidates for mayor. You're going to have. We're going to crisscross these subjects so often. You're going to have plenty of chance.
I want to come back on those two specifics at some point.
Fine.
Yep.
Well, you may have the chance right now. Let me just say, in terms of the candidates, if you look at the president's record, both the president and Governor Romney talk about creating jobs, manufacturing jobs. Everything's going to come up roses. Okay. Now let's talk about the record. Let's talk about the record of each one, and talk about your own candidate, and not about the other candidate. Sure. Okay. So here we have the president, who is going to bring unemployment down much lower than it is today. We're sitting in an economy with 25 million people who are either unemployed or employed part-time and would like to work full-time, or they've dropped out of the labor force. So what is there in the president's record, his record, that says to the electorate, you can believe me when I say I'm actually going to move jobs forward in the future?
Well, first of all, there's really quite impressively, and I'm sure people in the room know, I suspect many people in the room are looking at this trend as happily as I am. We've added 500,000 manufacturing jobs over the last couple of years, and that is a reversal of a more than decade-long trend. Now, you can't say that it's going to last forever, because nobody knows the future. But that's something the president has every right to brag on, and something we really need to build on. I guess it really relates to my last answer, which is, the president actually has a very elaborate manufacturing agenda. Part of it has to do with tax policy, and he has proposed a set of changes to the tax code to incentivize onshoring and disincentivize offshoring, and I can go through those. He has quite an elaborate set of tax plans to do so, that are explained in a Treasury white paper, brings the corporate rate down from where it is to 28%, and unlike his opponent, he's actually elaborated the base broadeners that would help pay for that. So there's that. There's the regional clusters. There's the innovation sectors to take production processes from the university to the lab floor. There's, again, on the tax side, there's the making the R&E tax credit permanent. I actually think that's an important thing for certainty in the industry. Something the Romney camp opposes, the production tax credit. I mentioned $8 billion for. Well, look, if you want to call me on time, and I'm going through the agenda.
Yeah, no, I do want to call. No, if
well,
you,
okay,
just wants you to go through it succinctly.
No, it's up to you to get through the agenda faster. Okay, no, I'm sorry.
Well, okay, I still have more, but I'll get back.
Well, we may.
I mean, you asked me the agenda. I'm not laying it out.
Yeah,
for you.
well, we may have those other questions come up a bit later on R&D and other things. Now, let me just ask you, on the basis of Governor Romney's record, okay?
Yeah.
Governor Romney's record. Governor Perry of Texas wasn't terribly impressed with Governor Romney's job creation record as governor of Massachusetts. And if you listen to his rhetoric today and what he's talking about, get the government out of the way, more deregulation, lower the tax rates, let small business go, at least to my ears and to the ears of at least one person in the last debate, that sounds very much like what George W. Bush told us in 2000, and we wound up with the worst job creation record in manufacturing. We lost 5.5 million jobs in that decade. We had the worst growth rate of 7 decades, and we had
until this one.
No, but this is all part of it. I mean, if you can separate that, if you as an economist can actually separate these things, that's very interesting. Because if you start with 2000 and go to 2007, it's the worst job creation record in 7 decades, and you also lost 59,000 industrial plants, manufacturing. So the very thing that Governor Romney's talking about doing paid off terribly.
I'd love to know where you get those statistics, because having lived that inside the administration, being responsible for manufacturing and what policy approaches we adopted, and understanding what we were doing tax-wise in response to a recession we inherited from the Clinton administration and the end of the dot-com boom and the corporate scandals and all the other things that were putting a depressing effect on the economy, the job creation record actually was remarkable in response to tax cut and some very significant reforms that left more money in the middle class's pocket through a lot of devices like education accounts, health savings accounts, things that actually helped the middle class.
But so why did we lose so many manufacturing jobs during that period?
Well, at the same time, there's an awful lot of other things going on in the economy that were having a big impact on manufacturing, not just by virtue of the things I described, which was the outsourcing and the way artifacts of the way we count. There's no doubt that what we've seen over the last 20 years in terms of the integration of global markets for a variety of reasons put enormous downward pressure on industrial goods, their prices, globally. And that has driven an awful lot of productivity gains. That means you're going to start using machines. Any job that can be done by an algorithm is going to be done by a computer. It's not going to be done by an individual. Our job at this point, I think, honestly, Rick, regardless of the campaigns, is to say, how do we train people so that they're the people who are shaping what the algorithm does and what the computer does, rather than saying we want to keep doing the jobs that were there at the turn of the 20th century rather than 21st century.
Time problem. You have a rebuttal, or you want to move on?
I want to finish my last exposition.
That's your rebuttal time. And he gets rebuttal time too.
All right, so I will begin by rebutting, and then I'll say what I want to say.
At least you're honest about it. Candidates never do.
Right. Look, we may have a factual disagreement here. I mean, I view the middle class as being, I should say, I think the data are quite strong, that the middle class did particularly poorly in the 2000s. And I'm not saying that was exclusively a function of presidential policy.
That's sweet policies.
I thought it was part of it. I thought those policies were hurtful to the economy in those years. But this was an ongoing process of inequality. It is a fact that middle class incomes, for the first expansion on record, were actually stagnant over the full business cycle. Poverty went up in those years. So it was. I agree more with Rick's assessment, at least of the living standard impact on people in those years. Look, I just want to finish this because it's really important. Very key parts of the president's agenda, and I think they're at least I think they're different in important ways from his opponents, have to do with exports and trade enforcement, as well as investment in clean energy, and then the autos, which is looking backwards. I thought, there's a big difference on autos. It's made and it's made a very important difference, I think, in the vibrancy of that sector of our manufacturing.
Okay, Mr. Aldonas, you got rebuttal time there.
Yeah,
Equal.
no, Jared, there was a wonderful gloss on the president's policy. And yet what we witnessed factually at that point in time was the corporate tax rate rise to be the highest among OECD countries. So the idea that somehow through the mechanics of individual tax cuts, you're having a big impact on whether this was a place people want to invest, the numbers were going in the opposite direction from the point of where we want to be. So what does Romney say? We got to bring that down at least to the OECD average as a practical matter. We got to move
By it, you mean the corporate tax rate?
The corporate tax rate.
Right, okay.
And that is going to be by closing loopholes. So now let's take a look at a good example of that, energy. Because this has a big impact on manufacturing employment in the United States. Mm-hmm. What are the policies in terms of expanding energy production? You have the Department of Interior taking land and resources out of production. Can't bid on that, can't drill. You have an EPA that's resisting the revolution in technology that is the natural gas revolution, and it has brought the assets in the Permian Basin in Texas back into play in terms of the production of petroleum. From Romney's perspective, he wants to eliminate the policies both in Interior and at EPA that are making that problematic. He wants to build a Keystone pipeline. He wants to make sure that what we're doing is making sure that investment will flow to that rather than Solyndra, A123, $90 billion in tax credits for alternative energy that won't work in the marketplace.
Sorry, I got to stop you, but
Okay.
I'm going to carry that argument on. So let's go into this energy thing, because we do have the recent development of very cheap energy in this country through natural gas. And we've got prices in this country, others tell me, and I hope I've got their numbers right, $3 per 1,000 cubic feet here, and $10 in either Japan or Europe, and $15 in the other place. So let me just ask you, Jared, the point that Grant is making here. Namely, that the administration is hindering the development of natural gas as rapidly as possible, and that's holding back the development of manufacturing, because it's a great cost advantage.
Look, I couldn't disagree more. I think what's hindering the use of natural gas in manufacturing is the the fact that the infrastructure is still young. For every $10 we spend on energy, only one is on natural gas right now, because we simply don't have yet the infrastructure to employ that in the manufacturing.
Bring the gas to the manufacturers.
And to have the machinery actually run off that kind of gas versus fossil fuels. But the price difference is very much incentivizing that, and we're moving strongly in the right direction. Look, I'll let everybody go read the fact checkers on all the points that we disagree on energy. I thought that the president has a great deal to brag on the energy production, and it's not just fracking, which of course is a big part of the natural gas. By the way, fracking is a good example of a government investment role that led to an important industrial.
What do you mean by that? Just explain it.
So one of my themes is, and Grant and I agree on this, is the role for government in investments that have have important implications in building industries within manufacturing. Well, natural gas exploration to this day is very much a function of early government investments in that technology that private industry wouldn't make because the returns were so uncertain. It's a key externality and one of the rationales for manufacturing playing the role it does. Look, on the corporate tax thing, I just got to say very quickly.
We're going to do corporate tax.
We're
going to do
Romney
corporate
wants
tax.
to go to 25%.
We're going to do corporate tax.
Obama wants to go to 28%.
We're going to do corporate
Big
tax.
difference.
Let's just stick with the energy thing for a moment.
Yeah,
All right, let's have your comeback.
Yeah, no, honestly though, Jared, if you think about what you just said, even if I assumed the case that you were proposing, that we're really talking about this problem of the infrastructure not being there, why would you then suggest that imposing an EPA rule that cuts off the possibility of using a coal-fired plant now and drives up the cost and creates a higher cost of adaptation for companies to get to that natural gas thing? Why would you adopt that as a policy now if you were interested in preserving manufacturing? Because that's what the administration has done?
It's a fair question, and it's a good question. Because the problem with the framing of the question, it is a good question, is that it assumes that such EPA rules are pure costs and no benefits. The EPA doesn't make those rules because it wants to block energy exploration. It makes those rules to protect us from the harmful pollutive effects of certain types of coal production. And you heard the president say, I'm for clean coal, and I agree with that. So to cite the EPA as constantly a source of cost without looking at the benefit side of the equation, I think you're short-sighted.
Well, I may be short-sighted, but the reality is, in the context of manufacturing, you're saying, I'm going to impose the cost now. There's a valley of death between here and where we get to with the infrastructure that allows us to go to natural gas, which I actually disagree with, because all the plants that are coming on assume that we're going to be moving ahead on natural gas. But having said
that's true.
You're creating this valley of death. Well, what's that saying to the investor in manufacturing at that point? Do I have a 5-year window where I should be investing in China rather than in the United States?
How can there possibly be a valley of death when you look at the production acceleration of natural gas? I mean, I think the actual facts of the prices and the exploration and the amount that we're actually pulling out of the ground. I mean, and just talking about energy in general, this is the first time, I think it was 2011 was the first time in 60 years that we, the United States, was a net export of petroleum products. I mean, that's amazing. Never happened in my lifetime.
But having said that, Jared, what you're talking about is the infrastructure of power generation distribution, not the energy that's coming out of the ground. The energy comes out of the ground, we got low prices, lots of supply, but if the infrastructure is there to drive it into electricity costs that come down for manufacturers,
I don't think the
we haven't
EPA plays
helped
any role
ourselves.
in that.
And that's one of the reasons why you see people saying, well, geez, we better export natural gas and coal because we can't sell it here.
I don't think the EPA is playing any role in preventing any manufacturer from building a machine that uses natural gas versus fossil fuel. So I just think the energy thing is a canard.
Can I shift you guys to another
difference.
subject, which is China? Well, we've got a difference delineated,
Absolutely.
and that was the point. What do we do about China? We're running a $295 billion trade deficit with China. It's been going up. A lot of it's manufacturing goods. A lot of it is in high tech, which at one point we thought was going to be our salvation and our protection. We got several problems. We got theft of intellectual products, copyright material all across the board. We got huge subsidies in China. Indigenous innovation is the requirement, and we got a currency problem. All right, so let me just ask you, first off, Mr. Aldonas, should we be declaring China a currency manipulator so that we can then invoke counter strategies of tariffs and so forth?
Well, so I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in kind of a bad neighborhood in Minneapolis, you know. And
we wondered.
And you know, we weren't afraid to say honest things. We weren't afraid to say exactly what was really going on. They do manipulate their currency. And the irony is that while it has appreciated, I agree with that completely, lately they've been intervening in it even more because they see the value of the renminbi against the euro rising while the euro is falling against the dollar. So they've been intervening to drive that down because Europe is actually a larger market for them than the United States. So the irony is that while we made some progress, in fact, right now, we're seeing a drive to drive that down. So when you look at that suite of policies, you're actually looking at a country that is saying, I'd like to take advantage of the benefits of the trading system. I'm not willing actually to adopt a suite of policies that means that the playing field is going to be level and that it's going to be a fair competition. Now that's on top of the fact that from the point of U.S. manufacturers who have to go to the markets for their capital, the cost of capital is near zero for an industrial enterprise in China. It can go to one of the banks there and say, I need this. It gets the influence of, my former counterpart, Beau Shalai, to influence the local provincial bank. And guess what? They're not competing for capital the way a private enterprise has to. That's a model of state capitalism that has to be confronted and addressed. And there's two ways to do that. One is to say, on the enforcement side, and this is something where I applaud my friend Tim Rife at USTR, who's the general counsel there, done a great job.
I'm going to come back. We're going to do several China questions.
Sure.
Let me just stay on the currency question here with you, Jared. So should the president in the next term be declaring China a currency manipulator and then letting Schumer and the folks up on the Hill go ahead with their penalty tariffs and so
Oh, well, now that's a different
Those
question.
are two different things.
Two different things, yeah. And I'm for both of them, and I suspect you're for one of them. Yeah, I mean, I think if you have I'm sort of where Grant is on this. I mean, if you've got a rule that people who manage their currency or manipulate their currency should be labeled as such, and you know that China's doing that, to not label them seems very cognitively dissonant to me. I just don't get it. And now, it is true, I remember as a member of the administration, I often scratched my head in meetings with colleagues on this very point. And what people will tell you, and Grant, you've been in this fray as well, so I'd be interested in your view. People will tell you, look, we get it, we understand, it makes sense, but if you're actually sitting across the table and negotiating with these people, that doesn't help you. It really won't get you where you want to go because that just pisses them off or something like that. I've never sat at the table and negotiated, frankly, but if that's the case, then don't have a policy that says we're going to label people and then not label them. So that's one. But really, I don't think that would do nearly as much as the Levin or Schumer legislation that I think goes considerably further, though not too far in my view, has had bipartisan support in both houses, actually got 99 Republican votes in the Congress before this one, and this is a bill that would provide the administration the ability to see countervailing duties piece by piece. It's not a broad thing. It's like you have to do it on product by product, and I think the president would sign that. I am quite certain Governor Romney probably wouldn't.
Well, answer on that?
Yeah, the point is the law already allows you to do that. Having worked on the Hill, I'm not all that interested in trying to force people to take what I describe as sort of illustrative votes that just they get to make a political point of it. But the countervailing duty allows this at this point. You can go after China on the basis of you can go after them on the basis of subsidy. Now, there's things that you have to prove. There's things that you have to prove as a part of that. I like the discipline of that process and the beauty of it in response to our friends who I've faced that as well, who say, it's always the guys at the Treasury Department, I hate to say it, Jared, they put on this, conical hat with the moon and stars and a cloak, and they say, finance is too complex, you can't understand it. What they really mean is, leave us alone, we're happy in our little sandbox, right? And I don't feel constrained. Again, it's the Midwesterner, and we go, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. And the reality is, it's time to call that bluff, right? Because
and there's no danger in your mind with their holding $1.2 trillion of American Treasury bonds that at some point...
No, honestly, quite the opposite. Yeah. It's the old line about Wall Street is that when you owe the bank $1 million, they own you. When you owe them $1.3 trillion, you own the bank, for God's sakes, right? Okay. The idea that...
You agree with that?
The idea that that's as much a threat as people make out, I think, is simply wrong. And I say that now more seriously, is that those dollars have to come back. They either have to come back in buying our goods or they're going to be making investments in the United States. We have to decide which we want. My view, we want to be exporting, right? I mean, I don't want to discourage Chinese investment. I want it to be sound. I want it to be based on market principles, but I want to be exporting, right? So that'd be where I'd be headed with
and a weaker dollar, which would emanate from the policies Grant is espousing, would help us in that regard.
And so I got to say, Bernanke is doing his best.
Let me change to the subject.
He's doing fine work.
Change to the subject of Chinese industrial subsidies. You've got Craig Barrett, former CEO of Intel, saying it cost me $1 billion less to build a chip fab in China than it does in America. I get the land either free or nearly free. You just mentioned the business of capital costs next to nothing. Infrastructure gets put in, the roads, all the utilities, all that kind of stuff. And then you get tax abatement, for many, many years. All right. How do we deal with that? Do we match the subsidies, or do we go to the WTO or wherever we need to go and fight them on subsidies that violate global rules, at least in our view?
And this is one of those things where I like what Governor Romney's strategy is, and that's because it is very aggressive with respect to the enforcement of the rules. At times, taking things, it's a little bit like civil rights legislation. You remember the Justice Department drove an awful lot of issues that people said, well, I don't think you can win that case. But they did it anyway in times to prove that there was a problem with the rules, that we had to do something more in terms of the disciplines. So I want to be very aggressive. What I hear for Governor Ryan said, very aggressive on the enforcement side, WTO and under our own domestic laws like CVD and dumping and things like that. The other side of it, and that includes the IP stuff, the other side of it, though, is you have to create an incentive. Nobody's going to push the Chinese anywhere. Nobody's going to push us anywhere. But we can create an incentive for them to adopt a different set of rules. That really obliges us to go very aggressively to the negotiating table and say, we've got to have a set of disciplines, and then we have to have that outcompete the Chinese for investment, right? So let's say it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
So this is the matching.
That's right. This is matching, not subsidy for subsidy. This is saying, I want to create an environment in the most dynamic economic region in the world, in Asia, where the rules are such that everybody's obliged to go to the market, to face the competitive factors that the Chinese don't face. And then guess what? I am certain that if Vietnam's a part of that, they will start to outcompete China for investment. We will start to outcompete China for investment. You already see it. At the last trip to Hong Kong, the entrepreneurs that were leaving China was surprising because of many of the policies adopted, which ironically, Rick, favor the red chip and the state-owned companies rather than the entrepreneur in China. But the reality is we've got to also try and create something which says to those folks in the old Shanghai reform movement in China that they're better off moving in the direction of further liberalization. So at the same time I want to hammer the bad things, I want to create that incentive for them to actually come in the direction of better rules and forcing everybody to compete in a market business.
Well, how do we do with the Chinese subsidies?
So I think that the only way that's to do this is the ways that have worked so far, and to do more of that. I actually think the administration has been quite good on this. Yes, it's true that they haven't labeled, and you heard my view on that, China as a currency manipulator. But more than any administration I can think of in the past, they've actually gotten very tough on non-tariff barriers, and I would include currency as one of those. Now, I happen to, we have a factual disagreement, and we should straighten that out ourselves. It's my understanding that to bring countervailing duties against a subsidy currency, a currency subsidy, and not just from China. If you read the work of Joe Gagnon, which I've been very moved by, it's not just China. There's a lot of that
That's
going
true.
on. And it's very costly to our economy by his analysis, which I think is quite rigorous. And the currency has appreciated. When you hit the Chinese on a particular good, or even on currency, they respond. But they only respond as long as they have to, and then they stop, and they go back to their old ways, as Grant described a minute ago. So I think the case that we brought against tires was very effective. Anything under Section 421, which was how the tire case was brought. I think the steel case, I think there's a rare earths
And
case.
would you just, for the people across the country,
Sure,
would you
sure.
just say what the tire and the steel case
So
mean?
the idea here is that within an international body, it wasn't the WTO in this case, it was the other one. Anyway, I'm blocking on the institution, but it's where when a country is subsidizing its exports to your country so that they get a bigger market share, you're able to, through these policies I've mentioned, impose a tariff or a duty, some kind of tax that makes those those imports into your country more expensive. And they've been flooding our market. They were flooding our market with cheap tires, with cheap steel, and they've been protecting their rare earths. Those are materials that are very important in certain aspects of production. And through policies that the administration has pursued, we've imposed a cost on that, and I think that's been very effective.
Okay, I just want to come back. I want to give you a chance. You can answer that.
No, I
but
don't
wrap
want to,
into
I just
wrap
want
into
to
your
say, Rick,
answer.
just as a factual matter, and I'm not going to expect you to know this, Jared. This happens to be not only somebody who was a trade lawyer, was the chief trade counsel on the finance committee, but then as undersecretary was responsible for administering this. The Commerce Department has made a series of decisions dating all the way back to the second lumber dispute that actually elide the problem of what's known as the specificity test with respect to certain subsidies. And what we haven't done in terms of thinking hard about countervailing duty law, and this administration hasn't done it, something any administration should do in my view, is take a hard look at where those precedents would allow you to go after the Chinese, because those have been sustained by U.S. courts. Now, if this is a fight that the Chinese want to take to the WTO, that's where I want to have the discussion, right? Because I want to either illustrate that we're right in imposing countervailing duties against these subsidies that pull jobs out of America, or I want to say the rules are insufficient in terms of the disciplines they impose on this behavior, which clearly undermines the value of the WTO and the system.
Okay, let me. I just want to ask both of you, and practically.
So that was, I hate to say, that was not addressed to the audience.
Okay, I just want to ask both of you.
Television, sadly.
In practical terms, I mean, almost everybody has said one way or another, in particular challengers say, you got to get tougher with the Chinese, you got to do something.
Yeah.
So I want to understand how the heck we can distinguish between talking the talk and walking the walk. It's just too easy to say we got to do this, that, and the other thing, and you've got a wonderful knowledge of and explanation of, but the question is, in the end, how do we know that in fact is what Governor Romney is going to do or President Obama is going to do in the second term as a fact?
So President Obama has done the actions I've described in his first term. Those, if I wasn't clear about that, I should be. The actions against the tires, the steel, the rare earths are all actions that were taken in the first term. Now, I actually believe that it may well, you sound like you know what you're talking about, which doesn't mean you do.
No, that's right, I'm a lawyer, so.
So it may well be that—
You might want to discount that.
Right, I do. It may well be that what you did, the machinations you just described in your last answer can actually work. But I would feel better if we actually had a simple piece of legislation, of which this Levin bill is, that says when there is evidence of a subsidy, a currency subsidy, that's leading to the kinds of problems we're both very frustrated about and is robbing lots of output and jobs from our economy, you can bring a case that the administration, without going through the WTO and all these kinds of machinations, can bring a case. Now, you may have to bring that case to the WTO, but you don't have to go to the WTO to find out if you can bring the case. Can bring a case in that area. And while the administration, to be honest, the administration has not said we're all for this. I do believe that if it got to their desk, they would sign it.
Okay, and walking the walk. How do we know?
Well, a couple things. One is clearly when he's been asked again and again and again by skeptics about what are you going to do about currency, he has said, and I take this as an article of faith, this is coming from him, not his advisors, right? That he is going to declare them a currency manipulator day one, fully understanding what flows from that in terms of action under our trade laws. And going to meaning embracing the idea that the currency necessarily does imply a subsidy, and then we have to start moving under the countervailing duty law without waiting for the legislation.
Okay, so you're saying he would declare, and then he would then start doing countervailing duties.
And there's a number of other areas where the proposals that have been discussed and that he's put forward have talked about doing things we absolutely have to do. And I'm sure Jerry would agree with this. The reality of our intellectual property laws and the enforcement tools we have are not adequate for the world that our manufacturers actually operate in. A lot of the violations of our IP laws come to us in a component in a finished product that reaches our shore. And the way our rules work, it's very hard to get to that. So what we have to be doing is actually developing this suite of tools that addresses the challenge that didn't used to exist. Remember I was talking about sort of in the green room vertical integration, arm's length transactions. That world we have an IP regime for. The world of global value chains, we do not have an IP enforcement set of tools for that world, and we need to build that.
So a very important thing to add here. I think I think our disagreements on this may be actually pretty subtle. We both seem to agree that currency manipulation is a big problem and that we should do something administratively about it. I think I'd go further than you in terms of this legislation, but put that. The other side of the coin is, I think, a very big and important difference between the two sides that hasn't come up yet, and that's the extent to which you would actually invest in domestic manufacturing here. And I'm not talking about beating the Chinese at their own game. I don't want to do the kinds of state-owned enterprise investments that they do, or the extent, or manipulate currency. I think that stuff should be set in markets. But I ticked through these ideas earlier of the innovation idea, the cluster idea, some of the tax policies idea. I think that kind of investment, infrastructure, clean energy, would absolutely be precluded by the budgets that I've heard from Paul Ryan and from Governor Romney. And I think that that's really important. Now, we haven't talked about it at all. I think Grant has a lot of very good ideas in this investment space. I don't think there's any money for that in Governor Romney's budget. I mean, you have to understand that this is a guy who's saying, I'm going to cap spending at 20% of GDP, 4% of that is going to be on defense. That means 16% has to be for everything else. And if you start looking at the cuts that implies, agency by agency, you're going to have to cut right into the bone in a lot of these programs, many of which aren't even all that large. A manufacturing extension partnership, the kinds of innovation clusters that I've been talking about. I don't see how that investment becomes part of a budget that is that austere.
Okay.
I would say, based on my experience at the Commerce Department, I have lots of friends who are alumni, we could find 4% out of $500 million that we would cut. And that wouldn't go materially to the sorts of programs that Jared's talking about, because in previous conversations, Jared, I have agreed. I don't actually know Governor Romney's view of this, but I wrote a book a couple of years ago about globalization of the American worker. One of the things I took away from that was the value of Head Start programs, right? Everything's baked in the cake by the time you hit grade school. So I want a cup of milk in that child's, table.
But are you buying, I'm sorry, I want to understand, are you buying the kind of programs, the government role in stimulating growth and investment in a variety of programs, such as those that Jared has
That's where I was
outlined?
going, Rick. I was actually saying no. What I buy are a suite of complementary policies that actually help individuals. What I don't buy are things that give us Solyndra A123 and things of that order. The problem, of course, from my perspective...
Nobody wants a failure.
No, but bear with me.
Is it the policy that's wrong?
The problem is when you expand government from 20 comes from my background doing development economics. When you expand government from a 20% take to a 25% take, you have to consider what that does in terms of drawing the influence of lobbying and potential corruption. Like we just had a big case today with the Army Corps of Engineers. The more money that's in the trough, the more you're encouraging this behavior. So one of the things you worry about as somebody who cares about transparency is the more money that's there, the more that you attract the rent-seeking behavior, which is the worst form of entrepreneurialism. So when you say that I want to encourage these sorts of programs, I would rather encourage a suite of policies that encourage investment and allow the market to dictate where that investment should go, rather than trying to put somebody in the business of saying winners and losers.
So do you buy the estimate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that we're losing $1 trillion in growth in America and untold billions in exports because our transportation system is so out of date, because it takes as long to move a freight train through Chicago as it does to get it from Los Angeles to Chicago, and that our airports and highways and bridges and all through... You buy that argument, and they're saying...
Remember, Rick, I'm from a town where the major bridge collapsed because of pigeon poop. So yes, I do agree that we got a big problem with it. You can't fly through LAX and not say, geez, we may be in a developing country.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, but I mean,
the
next question is there a government role there? I mean, there are people who are calling for infrastructure spending that will mean not only construction jobs, but manufacturing
I got a great example. My parents were always wise enough to get me out of town in the summer because they figured I'd get in trouble. So a lot of it was spent as a canoe guide in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. There's a lighthouse there called the Split Rock Lighthouse. And
we know what that's.
There you go. And the reason I chose that for my little business is it's a perfect example. In the absence of the investment in that lighthouse, which government had to do, it's a public good. No individual company would have invested in that. You wouldn't have opened up either the Iron Range for the U.S. steel industry or the wheat lands on both sides of the U.S. and Canadian border to world trade. You needed the lighthouse. That is the sorts of investment that government absolutely has to do. And I don't think that, and I think Jared and I would agree, that we've actually done a very good job of focusing on
But where do we get the money for that now?
The reality is we've got a lot of debts we're going to have to pay off. Now that may mean that on a number of suite of programs that we otherwise have at the Commerce Department, those are not going to be invested in because we do have to take care of infrastructure first, as far as I'm concerned. So that a lot of the things that we do as economic development, the Economic Development Administration, I'd be more interested in trying to drive that money through Head Start at first and then through infrastructure, rather than saying it's the sort
of... I mean, I'm with you on a lot of the ideas that you're espousing here, But I really think you need to take a much closer look at the budgets of your candidates here, particularly Paul Ryan, but also Governor Romney. Paul Ryan proposes over $5 trillion of cuts. 60% of them come from low-income programs, and that includes Head Start. Now, that doesn't mean that every dollar that's going into Head Start is efficiently spent, and we should make sure that it is. And I'm not defending every single dollar in these programs, but these, the Congressional Budget Office looked at the implications of the Ryan budget, a budget that Romney said he supported, numerous decades out, and they found that outside of entitlements and interest on the debt and defense, there's less than 4% of GDP left for all the things you just said. And you and I agree that those things are important. Those investments will simply be unaffordable under the kinds of budgets that these guys are espousing. And in fact, if we're going to have an amply funded government such that we can support a manufacturing sector in the way I think we should, that's going to involve some new revenues. And again, that's a big difference in both sides.
But in fairness, Jared, given where we are and the investments we have to make, why would you then invest in A123 and Solyndra?
Okay, I'll answer that. First of all, the A123 case is not a good example of what you're talking about.
Other than the fact it went bankrupt, and
well,
now
it was
taxpayers on the hook.
No, it was actually absorbed by Johnson Controls, and I just wrote about it this morning on my blog, jaredbernsteinblog.com, and you should read about that, because A123 was essentially consolidated into Johnson Controls and continues to create advanced battery technology. And in fact, this blog I wrote this morning called Battery Powered Growth is all about how our investments, largely from the Recovery Act, have made a real difference in precisely the way I tried to introduce in our introduction, where government has planted seed capital in a key sector that is not picking a winner as much as recognizing that there will be an economy out there, a country out there that dominates advanced battery production. I'd like it to be us.
Okay, I want to get to corporate tax reform.
Sure.
Okay, so I know you've got something else to say on this subject, but I just want to move to that topic before we run out of time here. How can we use the tax code to generate more business and jobs here at home, more manufacturing business here at home? I mean, you've got a situation here where companies that are working in America, doing all their work here in America, whether they're retail companies or trucking or railroads or hotels or whatever, they're paying pretty close to the maximum tax rate, the 35%. And you got companies that are operating overseas, and we have a whole slew of them, ExxonMobil, General Electric, Goldman Sachs, Merck. I can rattle through a whole lot of them, paid zero taxes, and a big reason was they had a whole lot of production overseas. Now, is that a sensible system for building job growth in this country or not? And try to avoid going into global and territorial taxes. Just talk to us about taxing here or taxing over there.
No, I think it's a perfect example of where the Obama administration has gone wrong. The very thing that Jared sort of signaled was a signature idea in terms of trying to provide an incentive tax-wise to reshoring, I guess is the phrase is, misunderstands what most of these investments are. 95% of humanity lives outside the borders. To be in those markets means we have to invest in those markets, even if it's just a sales office to promote our exports. The idea that then you would penalize the income that's generated by that overseas investment as a means of allowing us to be competitive in the global economy is simply false. The energy sector is actually a perfect example. Let's think about Exxon. We used to think of it, remember the days of Ida Tarbell and Standard Oil, and then we thought of the Seven Sisters in the 50s and 60s when we were being educated. Well, the reality today is the top 25 companies in the world, with the exception of Exxon, are all state-owned. And Exxon isn't in the top 20. Now the question is whether you want to raise the cost of capital for Exxon, because we still have the ghost of Ida Tarbell in our minds, and make sure they can't compete for resources and capital with CNOOC, with Gazprom, with everybody else in that market, or whether we're going to be wise about what the reality of energy is and where we have to invest. So the idea that we're penalizing that offshore investment, or that's what we want to do, take away their foreign tax credits. They're doing too much overseas. Happens to be where the oil is in many instances. Seems to me to be deeply inconsistent with the idea of that's where we have to be in order to compete in the global economy.
I think you just argued that we should nationalize Exxon.
So I don't know. I've seen PDVSA and Pemex. I don't think that's the route we want to go.
I want to talk about
This is
corporate.
your last shot, because I'm going to the
Okay.
audience. Okay, so,
So, look,
your answer on corporate tax.
Corporate taxation. I mean, I think it's very important in the manufacturing space for all the reasons Grant mentioned. Here's the thing that you got to know. I thought a lot of what Grant just talked about, respectfully, didn't get to the core difference here, which is this: the governor says he wants to bring the corporate tax rate down to 25%. Its statutory rate is 35%, but as you mentioned, lots of industries, there's a huge variation in the effective tax rate. If you look at the statutory rate, we're very high in international comparisons. If you look at the actual effective rate, what corporations pay, because of all the loopholes and such, and the international ones, in my view, are the most egregious, that's where you see us fourth from the bottom in terms of how high our effective tax rate is. The president wants to bring the rate down to 28%. The governor wants to go to 25. You want to argue about 3 percentage points? I think we probably agree that there's that either one of those would be a fine goal. But the difference is, and it's a huge difference, and I would love you to address this. I will cede whatever time you need. You got to specify how you're going to get there. Mitt Romney, with apologies, has absolutely been terrible in specifying how he's going to broaden the base. He says, trust me, I'll get to it later. Excuse me if I'm very nervous about that, because the history of Washington is that when people promise low rates and a broad base, you get a lot of the former and not much of the latter. The president has talked about accelerated depreciation. He's put it on the table. Debt financing, the way inventories are treated, transfer pricing, all this favorable, deferral, tax deferral, all this favorable treatment for income abroad, that stuff just incentivizes the outsourcing. And I'll just bring you back, and I'll close on this. I'll bring you back to my first comment, which was that when you offshore production, you offshore innovation as well. And that is not the direction for our sector to go.
But this actually highlights...
You got about 15 seconds, because I've got to go to the audience.
This highlights the problem with the president, in all honesty. He says he wants to reduce it to 28%. Every budget he has actually submitted drove the rate to 44, and what it did was adopt a series of policies that actually took away things that exposed income to double taxation.
You're conflating federal income tax with the corporate tax.
No. I'm talking about in the corporate income tax, in the budgets he submitted, there were provisions...
Has the corporate tax rate gone up from 35%?
The effective rate has risen to well above the...
Has the statutory gone up at all?
Okay.
No.
So let me go to the audience. And let me just tell you that I would like you to identify yourself. Wait for the ladies and gentlemen with the microphones to come around to you. Please ask a question and don't make a speech, and keep it relatively to the point. Okay?
Our timekeeper will...
I got one over here.
And remember, I'm parked at a meter outside. I have a vested interest in this.
Bob Maw from the FLCIO Industrial Union Council. I listened to all of what you just said about corporate tax rates. Deferrals are one of the biggest abominations out there as an incentive to offshore. In fact, we see 70% of the goods coming into this country from China, made by American firms that went to China, took the jobs from here, went to China, and all they want is access to our market. It wasn't so much about the Chinese market, and then they're allowed to hold the profits offshore and boost the bottom line. Yeah. I mean, this is part of the screwed up tax system of incentives.
So there's a question here.
And the question is, what would you do to get rid of deferrals?
Good question.
The answer is I'd move to a territorial system. Here's why.
No, you got to put that in language that other people can understand. You'd move to a system that...
Right now, we subject every dollar a U.S. firm earns to the potential for double taxation. And we try and come back to what taxing just the income they earn in the United States is through the system of foreign tax credits and deferral, subpart F income as it's usually referred to. The reality is that taking away the deferrals, taking away the foreign tax credits is a way of saying I'm going to penalize American companies who are trying to compete in global markets.
Okay, so let me just understand. What you just said means that you would not have any taxation on any foreign profits made by American corporations. Is that correct?
No American taxation.
No American taxation.
On income that is generated by activities that are done in those countries.
Overseas. And you and the president are on the other side saying we would get rid of the loopholes, that loophole which would cause that to be taxed without deferral.
That's right. I think I very much agree.
Meaning it'd be subject to double taxation.
Wait a second. I'm just trying to get the facts clear.
So those are the facts. So the president, in every one of his budgets, by the way, has proposed to get rid deferral for exactly the reason the questioner raised. And by the way, all the tax solution that Grant suggested does is it takes the deferral thing, it accepts it, makes it permanent. It says instead of having to just store your income over there to avoid taxation, we'll make a rule that you just never have to pay taxes on it as long as you just keep it over there. That is an incentive to go exactly the wrong way.
You mean to take jobs overseas?
No,
Why-
no,
what's the answer to that?
suggesting that it's not subject to taxation or escapes taxation is foolishness.
Except
it is,
American
it is,
taxation.
it is subject to very high taxation
In China?
in
In China?
Wait.
Wait.
Clyde,
Excuse me.
Clyde, wait a minute.
Excuse me.
Let's take it
Let
on the
me-
margin.
wait.
If you want to go after pharmaceutical companies that are parking
$1
IP,
trillion hiding in overseas tax havens.
hiding, Clyde?
Okay, so-
Hiding? How do you know they're hiding it when the IRS knows what's there?
Well, the
Seriously.
IRS, I did get that number from the IRS.
Excuse me. Question
But
here.
I do want to go back to the point about, you said we're getting all these things from China. I want to make a very important point because it's the misperception that drives a lot of the debate about globalization I think is wrong. I'm holding an iPhone in my hand. 6% of the value of this is the final assembly done in China. 60% of the value is what gets done in the United States. Every bit of this comes to us as, quote unquote, an import from China, right? Every bit of the value is counted as an import from China, regardless of where it's produced. Doesn't matter, it's our 60%, the stuff that comes from Japan, Taiwan, all that kind of stuff. I think what the question goes to, and I think deferral goes there too, is we actually need to think much more deeply than we have at this point. And I'm afraid the tax debate obscures it, about where value is actually created. Because I think in America, and particularly in American manufacturing, we create value. Not because of subsidies, not because of unfair competition. But we got to do that across the board. And if that drives our tax policy and it means deferral goes, I'm interested in making sure that we understand how value is created here and we tax that accordingly, and that we try and drive the international system in a way that does that.
Very simple. I absolutely agree about value creation, but value creation is intimately linked with innovation. Innovation is intimately linked with the production process here within our borders. And when you have the kind of tax policy that's either it's called territorial, that either allows the kind of games that are being played today, or simply exempts foreign earnings from American taxation, which is what it does, you start a chain of events that outsources not just production, but innovation and jobs as well.
Okay, question here.
Jared Jasanowski, former president of the National Association of Manufacturers. A great panel, and I think you covered policy issues with respect to manufacturing very well. I was very disappointed that there wasn't a better answer to your first question, Hedrick, which is, why is manufacturing so important to the United States? And here we are in the middle of a political campaign, and we're trying to get votes, and we've got a TV camera that's trying to communicate this to the public. And I think manufacturing is central to everything from national defense to innovation to education. And I would like to ask both of these good panelists to give us an impassioned statement that they would give to their candidates about why manufacturing is important.
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it, and you're absolutely right. I think we gave that short shrift. I think we both very much try to accentuate the importance, but not as passionately as we should have. So here's the thing.
This is one of the first debate phenomena.
Here's my impassioned thing. Not only, as we mentioned, is manufacturing responsible for 70% of our R&D and 90% of our patents, it's critically important for our productivity. And there's simply no way American living standards can increase without faster productivity growth. Take the manufacturing sector out of the picture, take the innovation embedded in that out of the picture, and we don't even have the potential for higher living standards. Now, we have a big problem in that productivity growth has been diverging from compensation. That's the inequality story. That's different. But you've got to have the growth that's necessary. It's not sufficient. It's necessary. Good quality jobs, 17% pay premium. And not just on the wage side, but on the benefit side as well. It comes right from the value added. And then there's the trade.
Pay premium, you mean manufacturing workers are getting 17%
more than non-manufacturing workers. And that includes not just the paycheck, but the health insurance and the pension benefits. Next point, our trade deficit. Our trade deficit is a drag on growth. And it's not just exports, it's net exports. You have to think about exports minus imports, and we're getting, and the only way we can unwind that in real time is by a stronger manufacturing sector that exports more. People who say we can do it through services are patently wrong in the near term, perhaps down the road, but right now, service exports are 25% of the trade deficit.
Great, go.
Let me amplify on one thing, Jerry, is that we once developed a manufacturing strategy together. We knew it was because not only was manufacturing important in itself, but that it provides thinking about manufacturing as a catalyst for what you want to see as good economic policy in every other aspect of American life, education, worker training. Using this as the force that drives that is what's important. Now here's the one point, and this is what I'd close on. We didn't have to wait for Congress to tell us to develop a manufacturing strategy. We knew what we were facing, and we knew that it required us to put forward ideas to get the process moving, to drive the public policy process forward. And the goal was to release a strategy that would do that in an election year, in part because you wanted to frame the debate in a way that the issue was joined. Sadly, that's not what we've gotten from the Obama administration, despite the protests. We had people on both sides of the aisle in Congress demanding a manufacturing strategy.
Okay.
Very quick.
No, I know, I will, but I want to get that lady back there first. I'm sorry, it wasn't your hand. It's that gentleman's hand. I thought it was her hand. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, Bill Frymore, Stewart and Stewart, wanted to ask about the media's role in all of this. Listening to you, the trade policies are fairly similar, at least the rhetoric's fairly similar. It's maybe on tax and budget where there's differences. But the problem, is it not, is sort of this Treasury perspective is still out there in the media. You look at USA Today editorials and two Washington Post editorials decrying China bashing, when in reality the United States is just trying to get China to live up to the rules of the international trade regime. How do we take what you're doing and keep the candidates focused on whichever one's elected, really having the courage to go against that mentality when they get in, either for the first or second terms?
Great question, and it does enable me to go where I wanted to go anyway.
These guys are endlessly
the alternative explanation was you were going there regardless.
Yeah, exactly. So it allows me to do it honestly. And it contradicts something my friend Grant said a minute ago. Look, and by the way, I take this from a great chapter by our own Clyde Prestowitz, who's in the audience here, called The Evolution of U.S. Trade Policy, which is a must-read for everybody. It's from a book called Manufacturing, A Better Future for America. And it takes you through trade policy history from the beginning of time, basically, in terms of America. And it shows the integral role of government in creating a manufacturing sector from the very beginning. I mean, tariffs were incredibly important. And the reason I say, to answer your question, somebody who parachuted into this debate today would think that someone who is arguing that we actually have to have a manufacturing policy, a trade policy, we have to push back on unfair practices by other economies, was some kind of wild-eyed, radical socialist, Kenyan, whatever.
It was Alexander Hamilton.
Exactly. He was born in Kenya.
He was born in the Caribbean islands.
So I think what these what these editorial boards are reflecting is a bias in neoclassical economics that evolved a few decades ago that has been shown to be completely bereft of actual real life. I mean, if nothing else, look at the financial collapse if you need evidence of that. But certainly in the manufacturing sector, it's very clear. So we really need to give these people some historical perspective and, in fact, make it clear. I did a presentation. In fact, we did a presentation. My presentation recently was about how I was taking apart a Washington Post editorial that was very much in the spirit of the questioner, and it called us protectionist for going after currency management. That's not protectionist. That's being a free trader. They're being protectionist. So it's topsy-turvy, and it's going to take an education program.
I need somebody from way over here in the back.
Rick, sorry. Bill,
we got to alternate. I got to get more people involved.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'll talk to you afterwards,
you get the next one.
And I'll tell you where I agree with Clyde at that point.
Okay.
Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group and American University. It's very good to see both of you.
How you doing, Dana?
Jared, you mentioned A123. I wanted to ask it, and both of you actually did. I wanted to ask it from a different perspective that's also very much in the news. Yes, Johnson Controls apparently there's some question about that in bankruptcy court, but apparently they are making a strong bid on that. But what I'd like to get from both of you is a comment about a prior suitor that may still be trying to get them, which is a Chinese auto parts company. To the extent that this is a firm which the administration put a lot of money in, that has some sort of technology that is valuable in some way, that's not defense related, should there be a policy with respect to screening of that kind of a potential acquisition from a foreign company?
Okay, Grant, this is for
Yep.
you, and you can take it wherever you want.
I agree.
And I'm actually going to answer the question, Dana. As you know, Dana, we have a policy about reviewing things for national security purposes in terms of investment. And we've limited it to that over time because we want to encourage investment in the United States. Well, the time has come to realize that there are different sorts of threats to our security. And the reality is that if what we're going to allow is investment by folks who aren't responsive to the cost of capital the way firms have to be in the United States, that don't have to pay their workers the way they have to with a decent set of labor institutions as we have in the United States, guess what? We need to be thinking very carefully, particularly where it's the taxpayer's investment, as to whether or not that's an investment that we're interested in, right? Do we actually want to say investment across the board, or do we have to exercise some judgment here about the sorts of investments, particularly because when I think about the folks on the other side, there's the 25 oil companies at the top of the ladder, they're not competing the way Exxon has to compete. And I'm not interested in that sort of investment because it's powerfully distorting to our economy as it is to theirs, just like their IP standards. The things they do in their own economy end up shorting our economic growth and global economic growth. And so that's not an investment I'm particularly interested in.
Wait, I'm sorry. I got it. There's so many other people. This is a very particularized question.
Haven't had that conversation.
I'm sorry. Back there. Just want to keep it moving, get more people involved.
Thanks for an excellent discussion. Rob Warren. I'd like to ask about trade policy. We haven't gotten into the free trade arrangements and where we're going, and what's the difference between the two candidates?
Yeah.
I'm astonished that the president stands up at every debate and says he signed 3 trade agreements. For gosh sakes, he didn't sign any. He hasn't even launched a negotiation, right? The one thing he has going in terms of a negotiation was started in the Bush administration. What he did was hold up the implementation of 3 trade agreements for 3 years while American manufacturers were locked out of those markets. That is not a trade policy that engages in the global trading system and takes our seat at the table with an effort to design the rules in ways that not only serve our interests. Look, I'm capable of being utterly mercantilist as America's salesman and saying, I want our goods in those markets. We got to break down those barriers. But just as important, adopting the system that we have in the United States is the most powerful thing we can do for economic development. So the idea that we want state capitalism to run rampant, we're not willing to engage in the negotiations and in shaping the rules that not only would define our future but make a brighter future globally, is appalling to me.
Can I respond to that?
Absolutely.
I very much liked Grant's previous answer, by the way. I didn't like that one. Look, man, I mean, first, there's two big disagreements we have. First of all, I think the president is absolutely legitimate to take credit for the 3 South Korea, Panama, Colombia. But let me tell you something. Signing a trade agreement and getting a trade agreement over the kind of humps that we did is far, far more difficult. And let me tell you, I was there for South Korea, and that was really touch and go and very hard. I think we have friends from the AFL here who
Jared, I have to
may
take
have
you
other
back
things to
just
say.
a little bit in history, because remember when Nancy Pelosi pulled the fast track? She did it because the votes were there.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that as a member of the administration who worked on getting these trade agreements over their humps, I'm telling you, it was a big deal.
Every
what's your
vote,
point
every
about
vote's
the
a hard
signing
vote.
or they're not signing?
Well, in a second. But here's the thing where I actually disagree pretty significantly on trade policy, which was the root of your question. I don't think that these free trade agreements have nearly the impact on trade, on globalization, than Grant's answer would imply. He said something about unleashing tremendous growth. I mean, it's just never happened that way. They're always advertised that way. There's going to be huge benefits for us. And every time, it never lives up to that. And in fact, I think that the people who make those claims about how dramatic the economy is going to improve because we signed a trade agreement and how many workers are going to benefit and how many states are going to get ahead are actually really hurting themselves because the public, very reasonably, doesn't buy it at all. So if you actually want to have more free trade policies be signed, more of these agreements be signed, then you have to take down this rhetoric about how they're going to solve all our problems. They're not.
So Jared, you know what? I would do that in a heartbeat if on the flip side, everybody would stop saying how damaging
And I
they
agree
are.
with that as well.
All right.
I agree with that as
Yes,
well.
right here.
I agree.
Mitzi.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to get back to your point about the importance of Head Start.
Yeah.
I think a major piece that is missing from our total educational system is, I guess, what I'm going to call complex systems. We train people to be an expert, and generally when I talk to someone like you, I'll say, we train them to understand your buttonhole, not to understand that the buttonhole is on your jacket, or that you're wearing the jacket, or that you're in the room. Everything's linked. We teach people to think in stovepipes, and the connection so you understand the consequences of the choices you're making. Anyway, I think there are dramatic changes that have to go on in our educational system starting in kindergarten.
You're absolutely right about that.
How do we make it happen?
The best work I've seen on that is by Golden and Katz out of Harvard, where what they illustrated was what we do in our educational system is we actually prepare young Americans to work in the industrial economy of the early 20th century, which the great thing about what Henry Ford did was he created a system of replaceable parts. The bad thing that Henry Ford did was he created a system of replaceable people. And that the skills that you needed there in that time were to turn the wrench, in effect. Now, if you look at what an auto worker does today, it's very different. You know, very, very different. But that training is not what you're prepared to do when you're coming out of high school. We're not actually educating people from the start for the world they're going to operate in, which is the world of the algorithm.
We don't have
And it is-
imperatives for this.
No, and I think talking about it systemically is a wonderful way to put it, because the way we actually deliver
Let me get to
in
some
terms of
the
raising
rhetoric.
human
We're almost
capital
out of time.
really does mean it's things that Governor Romney's comment on. Improving the public education system, I would add Head Start to that.
Look at the budgets.
And also expanding
Look at the budgets.
access. And I don't disagree with that.
Look at
actually.
the budgets, man.
You know, I think education is one of those areas where I think what President Obama and Arnie Duncan have been doing is moving us in the right
And
direction.
we've been laying off hundreds of thousands of teachers. Over
Yeah.
here, please. We're cutting budgets, laying off hundreds of thousands of teachers while we've been saying we want better education.
Ralph Gomery.
Somehow the mic is not working.
Just speak into it.
Speak directly into it like that.
Speak loud.
Do you hear me?
Yes!
All right. My name is Ralph Gomery. I am a professor at NYU, but I was director of research of IBM for 30 years, and I wrote a book about trade. Despite that, I had the greatest difficulty in following out the consequences of the various notions about making capital more easy, improving education, the impact of that on manufacturing. I think it's very complicated. I really don't understand it. If others do, I bow to them. My suggestion is that instead of emphasizing causes, we measure effects. Let me be concrete in a proposal. We need balanced trade because we're hemorrhaging jobs through the imbalance. All right? Some years ago, Warren Buffett proposed a very simple and straightforward way to balance trade. And not by putting a particular tariff on this, that, or the other thing, right? But simply by giving exporters certificates which importers had to buy. In other words, if you were successfully exporting, you get certificates. They're sold on the open market. In order to import, you have to buy the certificates. All right? That means it's an incentive to export and a limit on imports. But it does not cut down imports, just balance them to exports. It balances trade. It comes from Warren, who is not an idiot. All right?
Well, let me take exception with that. He's very smart about making money. But on public policy, this is a guy who talks about good game about taxes, but he's played the tax code like a fiddle.
Of course. He understands it.
He understands it?
Yes.
Well, wait a minute. I'm just asking for a little consistency. The companies he invests in do not do what you're describing.
I'm not asking them to. I'm asking us to consider a proposal of his, which seems to make sense, which measures the outcome of all these incentives.
But if you're an existentialist and you're saying, I want action, you've got to look at Warren's action. He does not act in the way you're describing.
Well, I would be less ad hominem, and I think that the policy...
That was ad hominem. You're absolutely right about that. I'm going to do it again if I get the chance.
I think, Ralph, I think the way you teed that up was exactly right. Let's look at the effects. I do think that not just persistent trade balances, but persistent trade imbalances of the magnitudes we've seen have been very destructive for growth, and they very much embody the kinds of problems that I've been trying to stress throughout the talk in hurting the manufacturing sector, as our friend from NAM was asking about earlier in terms of its importance. That particular plan is definitely an interesting one. It strikes me as extremely challenging legislatively. I would think that, just off the top of my head, I would think that the price impacts on imports would be non-trivial, and that's something that consumers would not like. And I can tell you, as a veteran of many of these debates, when you start fooling around with import prices, things get very complicated very quickly. You understand what I'm saying? I think.
You mean if the cost of stuff we're buying at Walmart goes up?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
People get excited.
So you know, and that strikes me as a potential issue there. However, one of the reasons those costs are so low is because of the very subsidies that we've both been suggesting should be stopped, and that's a bit of a hatchet. But I would be interested in looking at those types of ideas.
I've got to cut it off. I want to thank you both, Jared Bernstein and Grant Aldonas, for a very lively discussion, which surfaced a number of disagreements in a genial way.
I want to thank our moderator, Hedrick Smith, for doing a wonderful job.